a warm welcome to our side event at the UN Oceans Conference held virtually um, on marine geoengineering, a growing threat in the name of climate protection. My name is Linda Schneider and I work with the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin. So what is it that we're discussing today, and what is marine geoengineering? So marine geoengineering, from our perspective, is a growing concern. And we've got a range of speakers today who will talk about different aspects of why we are concerned about marine geoengineering. It is something that's currently being advanced by industry and by some governments in the name of addressing the climate crisis. And it is a growing threat to marine environments and ecosystems, and of increasing concern to local and international climate activists and experts, and also indigenous peoples and scientists. We'll watch a very short animation video first that will give you a bit of an overview and an introduction to the topic of marine geoengineering. And we'll dive into some presentations and Q&A with our speakers right after that. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a great range of speakers with us today, and I will now introduce the first speaker, who is Nestanyo with the ETC group in the Philippines, who has been working on geoengineering and marine geoengineering specifically for a very long time, and will tell us a bit more about the dangers of marine geoengineering, and in particular about the lessons that were learned from the early ocean fertilization experiments that were carried out in the Philippines. So over to you, Neth.
Thank you very much, Linda. As Linda said, I will be presenting a first-hand experience on ocean fertilization, ocean nourishment from the experience of the Philippines in the early years of marine geoengineering. And this was before all the regulatory measures were actually adopted at the global intergovernmental level. The ocean fertilization experiment that happened in the Philippines, also parts of Malaysia, was actually in 2007, 2008. And this was initiated by the Ocean Nourishment Corporation, which is a small spin-off company that was established by two professors from the University of Sydney at the time, led by Professor Ian Jones. And the aim of the corporation is mainly to promote a technology on ocean nourishment. They actually don't call it ocean fertilization. And the aim is to use nourishment to promote algal bloom in specific parts of the sea or oceans that they identify, to be able to stimulate the reduction of the removal of carbon from the atmosphere by the algal bloom, and burying that in the ocean bed, as explained in the video that was shown earlier. So that's the principle that Ocean Nourishment Corporation, or ONC, followed. They actually did not openly apply for the experiment in 2007. Instead, they actually went through the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, a small agency within the Ministry of Agriculture of the Philippines, and requested for a permit to do an experiment or a pilot testing on sustainable fisheries management. That's how it's called. It's not even called ocean nourishment or ocean or marine restoration. It was actually for sustainable marine fisheries management. And naturally, that falls under the mandate of that bureau, the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. And without divulging the technology, they sought permission to do this pilot on sustainable fisheries management in a particular part of the Philippines, which is actually in the northeastern part of the Sulu Sea, in Negros Island I think I was late in sending Nikki the map. I should have sent it earlier. But the Sulu Sea actually straddles the Philippines, the western part of the Philippines, central western part, and goes all the way to Sabah in Malaysia towards the west. So that's actually eastern part of Sabah. But for that experiment, they specifically target the northeastern part of the Sulu Sea, which falls under the jurisdiction of one province called Antique in the island of Negros. So the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources tacitly gave a permission. It was not actually a permit that they gave. They actually sent a response, no, to Dr. Ian Jones at the time, that we welcome your experiment, your pilot project on sustainable fisheries management. And this tacit permission was actually what ONC used as the permission to allow them to experiment on their ocean nourishment technique using urea, nitrogen fertilizer, and targeting specific parts, the dead zone part of the northeastern Sulu Sea in Antique Island. So there were actually conflicting reports on how many kilos of urea fertilizer they use for the fertilization experiment. There was no information that was made available publicly. What was known at that time was actually gathered from the local partner of ONC, who is a professor on marine science based at the University of the Philippines in the Visayas. So the whole experiment was actually kept in warps. Definitely no explicit permission coming from the government. So it was actually ETC Group that stumbled on that proposal that was posted in the ONC website by Dr. Ian Jones, and shared it with local NGOs, namely Sea Rise, Third World Network, Greenpeace, and also WWF. The World Wildlife Fund in the Philippines actually also took part in opposing this project. We brought this to the attention of the government, the Ministry of Environment, and also the local government units in that area. All of them oppose it, and also strongly opposed by fisheries organization and fisher folks organization, as well as marine science, the marine science community. The Marine Science Institute of the University of the Philippines, for example, came out with a very, very strong statement denouncing the experiment. And this actually forced the hands of ONC to go further below the radar. Media tried to interview them. They were actually invited by the Senate for a hearing. They did not show up, and that obliterated for any further information on this from the map. Like, even if you search now, you'll only find opposition. You'll probably find the proposal somewhere there by ONC. But the lessons, of course, the lessons were very useful for the Philippines, because this experience was the starting ground for the Philippines to bring this issue to the intergovernmental process. At the Convention on Biodiversity, there was already a move at that time led by ETC and also some governments to bring the issue of ocean fertilization and the implications on marine biodiversity at the CBD, and the Philippines supported that, bringing this experience forward, calling for the attention from the CBD on the adverse consequences on marine biodiversity. All of these were outlined in position papers of civil society, of fisher folks, and also of the marine science community, as well as the Ministry of Environment. One, that there are questionable implications of this technology on marine biodiversity itself. There's not, in fact, a single study done by ONC, the proponents or independent bodies, showing what would be the potential impact of nourishing the dead spots in the Sulu Sea with urea fertilizers. There were some studies presented by the UP University of the Philippines Marine Science Institute, showing how it could actually result to algal bloom. And that area is particularly prone to seasonal algal bloom, and also how it could present overnutrition to fingerlings, because that area is also known as a breeding ground of specific fishes that are very important for local fishermen who are dependent on marine resources for their livelihood and also for their family sustenance. So all of this were actually presented to the authorities and also presented by the Philippines in the arguments that led later to the adoption of the moratorium on ocean fertilization in the Convention on Biodiversity's Ninth Conference of the Parties, held in Bonn in 2008. And that, as mentioned in the video, that moratorium on ocean fertilization, the CBD rolled over towards a ban on ocean fertilization, in particular in marine geoengineering in general, in the London Convention, London Protocol, and the Philippines also supported the call for stricter regulation in the LCLP. And the key lesson here, of course, is the importance of more comprehensive and also open, democratic, and independent studies that could show, that could look into consequences of such technologies beyond what is being claimed by the proponents. Second, the indispensability of free and prior informed consent, whether that comes from the communities themselves, whether that's indigenous or local communities, in this case, fishing communities, or local governments, which has direct legal jurisdiction over such experiments that would have potential impacts on biodiversity and the environment. Third, the importance of having policies and regulations in place. Like we cannot have marine geoengineering technologies or geoengineering technologies in general in a wild west, and that is the worst direction that we could go. Indeed, there are intergovernmental measures that were put in place over the past 12 years, since 14 years, since 2008, but that's not enough. Like the discussions in the LCLP for further details on the ban on marine geoengineering is a step towards the right direction, but further inputs need to be put in there, and also furthering these discussions at the Convention on Biodiversity to add flesh to what was adopted in 2010 at COP10 on a soft moratorium on climate-related geoengineering in general, would be a good step for governments to go into, especially as there are more experiments on marine geoengineering that are on the table, that are already done, often without regulation and often without the knowledge of communities, and in some cases even by governments. Just as we thought that Ocean Nourishment Corporation has died after that vouch experiment in the Sulu Sea, I have to mention as well, no, that this is very important, that the ONC experiment in the Sulu Sea in 2007-2008 is directly related to the aim to earn carbon credits. This was very specific in the proposal that was uploaded in the website of ONC at the time, that they actually aim to apply for carbon credits on whatever emission that will be reduced from that experiment. And there are ongoing experiments as well that are going towards that, especially as the discussions on blue carbon and also leaning towards linking initiatives in the marine areas towards the upcoming carbon market, and all these trade market related measures to promote reduction emissions. There are experiments that are ongoing that needs to be looked at and monitored closely. ONC, for example, just as we thought it has died, it hasn't. It's actually involved in an ongoing experiment by WhaleX on creating artificial whale poop. Again, relying on nourishing the ocean by simulating the poop of whales that could actually, again, promote algal bloom that would lead to reduction of atmospheric emissions and burying them in the ocean floor, theoretically. And ONC is very much part of the experiment in some few hundred square kilometers in Australia, part of WhaleX. And there are also other companies that were earlier linked to other ocean fertilization or ocean nourishment experiments in the past 15 years, such as LOHAFEX, and also other companies that are now reviving themselves to be able to take advantage of the growing interest on marine environment as a key part of the solution in terms of reducing emissions globally. So I think I would stop there and allow Linda to lead this on to the next speaker or ask questions. Would also welcome questions from the audience.
Thank you, Ness. Yeah, so the audience is invited to share their questions in the chat. In the meantime, I will just ask you some follow-up questions, actually. So first of all, thank you, Ness, for sharing these early experiences with ocean fertilization. I mean, that's almost 15 years ago, right? And how that translated into the initial steps towards international regulation and governance of geoengineering, which is still very much needed and still very patchy and not very comprehensive. And as you mentioned, there are ongoing outdoor experiments, and we'll hear more about some other projects later on. But I wanted to ask you the follow-up question. So you mentioned the specific interest in in generating carbon credits. Maybe you can talk a bit more about who the actors are in the marine geoengineering space. Like, who are the actors who are interested in developing these technologies? What are the interests behind it? What about commercial interests in this field?
There are actually a number of interest actors that are investing time, intellectual juices, and also money on marine geoengineering. I think Nikki has actually shared in the chat like further information on ONC activities, and can also share some other the link for the other experiments in marine geoengineering that are going on. I already mentioned WhaleX, which is very much invested into the marketing of simulated whale poo, because they said that whale poo has actually played a key role in nourishing the ocean and promoting algal bloom that could actually reduce atmospheric emissions, particularly in oxygen depleted dead zones. Also, there are research institutes such as the GMR Center for Ocean Research in Germany that is involved in a number of experiments on artificial upwelling, funded by the European Research Program. Also, they have a project which is called the COSCO project, using mesosomes to investigate the effects of varying upwelling intensities on plankton communities in the Humboldt Current off Peru. GeoMar also coordinates the project Ocean Nets, which is ocean-based negative emissions technologies, which is underway since 2020. There are also a number of experiments by the Climate Foundation, headquartered in the USA. I have to mention this because this is another entity that has a lot of investments in terms of projects in the Philippines, in particular on seaweed cultivation, hand in hand with artificial upwelling. Like in recent years, there's been a tide, no, literally, a tide of interest on seaweed cultivation as a way to suck carbon from the atmosphere. And Climate Foundation has been leading this. They, as I mentioned, in the Philippines, they have a project. They're also very active in the Australian coast for over a decade now. There's also other artificial upwelling experiments in China and also in the US. Another suite of technologies are around marine geoengineering that's also gaining traction, of course, is enhanced weathering, which is actually using some nutrients or that would involve massive mining operations to be able to enhance weathering in the coast. So that would actually require finding suitable rocks and minerals, crush them, and to be able to spread it around in some coastal areas to absorb as much CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is very, very intensive, energy intensive technology, and would also require massive mining operations, because there's one study that showed that it would take approximately 2 tons of rock material, such as olivine, for example, to absorb 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So I think these are some of the things that I would mention. There's actually a whole list, and we could actually spend a session as well in discussing solar radiation management in the Great Barrier Reef area, which is also on marine, but of course about managing solar radiation, but done in marine environment. There's been a lot of investment by the Australian CSIRO, and also the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and the Queensland Institute of Technology and some other universities in Australia around some experiments that were done in 2019, 2020, partly funded by the Australian government. So Nikki will provide you with links to all this information. Sorry, that took time.
Thank you, no problem. Yeah, and I think it's definitely important to recognize, how there's a really strong push for ocean geoengineering currently, also at different international institutions, including inside events at the UN Oceans Conference, for example, or in the UNFCCC. Also, the IPCC has looked at marine geoengineering, so that really is kind of entering the mainstream of climate policy debates, right? So